Hello viewers, I have come to you today to give my second delivery. As I told you in my first delivery that in second delivery I would mention the background of the creation of the Israeli state. You know that the creation of the Israeli state was a kind of political and colonial agenda of the Western world, and particularly the colonial powers, especially France and Britain. And they have already made a project, and the project was particularly made during the First World War. And I would like to exactly mention a term which is known as Zionism. And in the beginning of my delivery, I would like to explain what is Zionism. Zionism is a political theory, a political agenda of Israel or the Jewish people who were once living in different parts of Europe before their coming to Palestine. In the initial stage, it was the assumption of the world community that Zionism was the brainchild of a particular Jew, a Jewish people, an Austrian-born Jewish people, Theodor Herzl. But gradually the world community could understand that it was not the brainchild of Theodor Herzl. The later research exactly revealed the fact that Zionism was a Christian project, particularly the project of the colonial powers of the Western world, especially Britain, France, and later on America. They have exactly set up this theory, Zionism, in the lips of an Austrian-born Jew. As I have already mentioned his name, Theodor Herzl. I would like to tell something about Theodor Herzl. He was professionally a practicing lawyer in Austria, in his birthplace. But suddenly, in the middle stage of his profession, he changed his profession and he adopted journalism as a profession. And the research about him exactly revealed the fact there was a particular motive behind his changing this profession. He adopted journalism as his profession in the middle of his profession and living the legal practice, that he wanted to exactly make a propaganda of Zionism, and the profession journalism would be convenient for him exactly to make this propaganda, particularly in the Western world, so that he could support in favor of Zionism. Zionism is a kind of theory, a political agenda or theory which exactly allowed the Jewish people to go to their so-called promised land, Palestine, exactly to create a homeland. It is definitely a political agenda. And Israeli scholars or Jewish scholars wanted to tell that Zionism is the political agenda which had been originated from Judaism, their spiritual agenda. Whatever the fact, when Theodor Herzl exactly adopted his profession as journalism in his life, he was exactly getting a certain kind of convenient position to make a propaganda of Zionism, to get the help of the international world, particularly the Western world, to create a homeland in Palestine. And the prominent the prominent papers and documents and dailies, weeklies of the Western world started helping this particular journalist, that means Theodor Herzl, for the propaganda of Zionism. Actually, by the help and the counseling of the Western world, especially Britain and France, this Austrian brilliant chap, Theodor Herzl, adopted journalism as his profession, only for propaganda. And this propaganda continued, and Zionism propaganda had been intensified, particularly during the First World War. You know that in the First World War, Zionism became very, very popular in the Western world. And the Western world, especially Britain and France and later in America, made a plan on the basis of Zionism. They would like to create a state for the Jewish people scattered living in different parts of the European countries, particularly the Eastern Semitic countries. And it was so happened. And not only that, in this connection, the Jewish scholars and particularly some Jewish people was making a certain kind of myth, and they established a myth which is that Israeli people or the Jewish people is the indigenous people or the early settlers of the Palestinian land. But definitely it is a fabricating history. It is not the real history. The real history is that the present Palestinian people are the present Palestinian people. Their forefathers were the primitive settlers or the earliest settlers of Palestine. Once upon a time, about 5,000 years ago, the present land of Palestine was called Canaan. And the people during the time living there was known as Canaan, was known as Canaanite. And the present Palestinian people exactly are the descendant of the Canaanite people who were living 5,000 years ago in the present land of Palestine. And after 2,000 years, that means the 3,000 years ago, the Jewish people, particularly from Iraq, Syria, they exactly started coming to the present Palestinian land. And they started coming after 2000, after the indigenous people, Palestinian people, in the present Palestinian land. You know, the history is that the earliest settlers are the Canaanite people, and they are and present Palestinian people are the direct descendant of the Canaanite people who were living 5,000 years ago in the Palestinian land. During the time of Ottoman rule in Palestine, once upon a time it was one of the provinces of Syria. And when Ottoman authority captured this land, the purchase and the buying and selling of the land in Palestine was going on. And especially the Jewish people started buying land in Palestine, and they started taking their settlement there. And it was exactly the exclusive starting of settlement of the Jewish people in the present Palestine. And they had a mind who had been exactly migrated from the Eastern European countries and purchasing land from the Palestinian people and started settling there. And their objective was exactly when there would be the majority in this land, they will create a certain kind of tussle against the Palestinian people. And later on, we had seen that it had been proved true. They had become a very fighting force against the Palestinian people. And when Ottoman Empire, particularly the Ottoman Sultan, had been defeated during First World War, Britain, France and America, particularly Britain and France, had taken a certain kind of strategy to make the control on the Arab land, and especially Palestine, Jordan, Iraq and Syria. And with this end in view, Britain and France appointed 2 diplomats in Palestine and Lebanon. And in this connection, I'd like to mention their names. Britain had appointed Mr. Sykes as the High Commissioner of Britain in Palestine. And on the other hand, France appointed Mr. Picot as the ambassador in Lebanon. The 2 diplomats had been appointed but they were not conducting any diplomatic course of works. They were found involved in spying, exactly to study the feasibility of creating a control of the Western world, particularly France and Britain, on Palestine, on especially on Arab land. And I'd like to mention here one of the important radical news that by this time it was a very convenient geological report to the Western world, especially Britain and France, that the whole Arab land was floating on oil resource. And Britain and France started feeling a fascination to control over this land in order to secure the oil resource, because the oil resource was very important for the expedition of the industry in their respective countries. And that is why the report was very much clear that the whole Arab world was floating on the oil resource. They had made a plan exactly to make the control over the Arab land. But Ottoman Empire was standing like the rock of the Himalaya. And it was really tough for France and Britain to defeat the Ottoman Empire. And in the First World War, Britain and France exclusively declared war against Turkey. And in 1915 and 16, Turkey was defeated at the hand of Britain and France. And it was an ample opportunity for Britain and France to make the control over the Arab land. And they initiated the agreement, which is known in the history as Sykes-Picot Agreement. And this agreement had given an assurance to the Arab land that they would liberate the Arab land from the hand of Turkey, because during the time the whole Arab Peninsula was being controlled by the Ottoman Empire. But when the war was ended, Britain and France had breached their contract, and they had broken the words given to the Arab world. They had made a division of the Arab Peninsula, particularly according to this division of partition. Iraq and Palestine had gone to the belonging of Britain, and Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine had gone to the belonging to the British authority, and on the other hand, Syria and Lebanon had gone to the control of France. And it was very convenient for France and Britain for this division to make the control. And not only that, during the time, the League of Nations was established. League of Nations was remaining, not the United Nations. United Nations had not been incepted during the time. Britain and France influenced League of Nations, and League of Nations was compelled to offer this particular land, that Palestine, Iraq, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, as mandatory states to France and Britain. According to the mandatory state, Britain and France installed their mandatory government. And this mandatory government, established by Britain and France, had given ample opportunity for the Jewish people to establish their so-called homeland in Palestine. That is the story of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine. And dear viewers, you can understand it very easily that the creation of the present Jewish state is the utter conspiracy, is the result of utter conspiracy of the Western world, especially Britain and France. I'd like to tell one thing, that the present world has been suffering so many crises, and it was not suddenly created. It has the long legacy, and this legacy was created by Britain and France. And for the legacy, the problematic legacy created by Britain and France had been and is being, has been the problems of the world community still today. And the world community, particularly the Asian nations, which are colonized by France and Britain once upon a time, they have been suffering this crisis still today. And now, the dear viewers, you can understand easily that what is the effect of the colonial policy to control the Arab world, which has been exactly suffered by the Palestinian people still today. It is a tragedy that the Palestinian people, in spite of being the indigenous people of present Palestine, they had been and they had been the vulnerable, very vulnerable nation race, and they have been suffering an acute problem for their existence in the Arab land. Today, I'd like to end my speech here, and it is the short background of the creation of the Israeli state. We have to remember one thing, that Israeli state is the creation of one kind of project of the Western world, especially Britain, France, and later on America. And Zionism is not simply the brainchild of Jewish people named Theodor Herzl. It is the project of the Western world in order to create a state by the Israeli people with an objective of creating a constant irritation in the Arab world, so that Arab world could not be united, Arab world might be engaged in arms conflict or face unrest situation. And in this unrest situation, Britain and France and America would control the wild resource of the Arab world, Arab Peninsula, and it is still been going on. Now, I'd like to give another lecture, another delivery, particularly on Israeli crisis. I'd like to tell one thing, that new Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has already taken oath as Prime Minister of Israel in 30th of this month, and he is an extremist Jew. He is the ardent follower of Zionism. And soon after his taking oath as Prime Minister, Israel, in a new shape, has already started the demonstration. Already they have made a demonstration in Jerusalem in order to create irritation and apprehension in the minds of the Palestinian people. And I'd like to end my speech today. Thank you very much. In next lecture, I'll complete exactly the situation that is being prevailing right now in the Palestine, and the people the Palestinian people have been facing the serious crisis. Thank you very much.